Okay, let's unpack this. We are not starting today with the glory of Rome, the marble, the law, the engineering we usually talk about. Instead, we're plunging right into the immediate, grim aftermath of a Roman military conquest. Specifically, that moment when the screams finally stop and the really methodical work of domination begins.
It's a stark image.
It is. Imagine Jerusalem, 70 CE. General Titus is just one. The smoke from the burning city, the scorched olive groves. It hangs so low it feels almost physical. You can see the cold gleam of the 10th Legion standards moving through the ruins. But the centurions, they aren't celebrating. They're not even looting randomly. They're performing a very specific, terrifying function.
They're systematically collecting the wives and children, specifically the wives of the defeated Jewish warriors.
Exactly. And our sources, particularly those who were actually there, describe this process. And it's not like random wartime brutality. They call it an intricately designed system of human destruction.
It's chilling language. And they go further, calling it the empire's most effective weapon of domination. It was designed, really, to guarantee that defiance just couldn't rise again from those ashes.
It forces us to sort of rethink what conquest actually meant to Rome, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It wasn't just about grabbing territory. It was about state-sponsored human commodification, turning people into assets. And we encounter this reality through these tragic, specific individuals.
Like Deborah Bat Elazar.
Yes. Just hours before the city finally fell, you have this woman, Deborah Bat Elazar. She's the wife of a Jewish rebel commander, a mother, daughter of a known family, a person with status connections.
That in the system.
In that methodical processing that followed the breach, she's dragged from some temporary shelter. Her child is literally torn from her arms, and her entire identity, her lineage, her religious standing, everything that made her, it's just erased.
Erased. That erasure you mentioned, that feels absolutely central to what we need to get into today.
It is. Because within hours, Deborah Bat Elazar ceases to exist in the Roman records. She becomes simply the red-haired one.
Just a physical description on a list?
Exactly. A line item on a manifest, destined for the slave markets hundreds of miles away in Caesarea. Nothing more.
That transformation from a named person, someone with deep cultural connections, to just a piece of inventory defined by a single physical trait that's the core of this Roman doctrine we're trying to understand today, isn't it?
That's precisely it.
So our goal in this deep dive for you listening is to really unpack this dark machinery of Roman imperialism. We're examining how the systematic exploitation of defeated warriors' wives was intentionally woven deep into Roman military, economic, and even legal doctrine.
And how this practice fundamentally altered the demographic landscape. We're talking about the ancient world across 3 continents. This isn't just about battles. It's about highly formalized long-term geopolitical control.
Control implemented through the absolute destruction of individual lives and families.
Okay, so to really grasp the cold efficiency of this system, we absolutely have to situate ourselves back in that strategic context. First Jewish-Roman War, culminating in 70 CE.
Right, Titus at the gates.
Exactly. General Titus, he's got 4 legions bearing down on Jerusalem. And the situation inside the city, well, it's already desperate, but it's made worse, much worse, by the fact that the population is artificially swollen.
Swollen? How?
Passover pilgrims. They were trapped inside the walls when the siege began. So you might have had perhaps triple the normal population crammed in there.
Yeah.
A humanitarian catastrophe waiting to happen.
And the rebel leaders inside, they'd held out for, what, 4 years? I must have thought they still had a chance.
They did. Tragically. They seemed to believe their localized resistance, however fierce, could somehow withstand the full, unified might of the Roman military machine. They fundamentally underestimated the nature of the Roman objective.
Which wasn't just victory.
No, precisely. The goal transcended simple military conquest. Titus was operating under directives, likely from Vespasian himself, designed to eradicate the possibility of future resistance. This conquest had to be a demonstration.
A lesson.
A brutal lesson. A lesson in consequences so profound it would deter future uprisings across the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Make an example of Judea.
Okay, and this leads us right to the systematic nature of their siege warfare. The sources you mentioned, like Josephus, he was actually there, wasn't he? A participant who defected.
Yes, Josephus provides this invaluable, though deeply painful, first-hand detail. He documents how meticulously calculated the whole siege operation was. It wasn't just throwing men at walls.
So it's psychological, too.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Josephus tells us, after about 15 days of relentless, brutal bombardment, the outer wall finally falls. But the Romans don't immediately launch a full-scale assault into the next section of the city.
They paused. Why?
They paused. And Josephus is clear. This wasn't battlefield fatigue or some kind of mercy. It was a deliberate, strategic decision. They wanted to allow fear, terror, despair, starvation to fester inside the city, maximize the psychological damage before the final push, break their spirit before breaking the final walls.
Chilling. And that transition point, from the high-intensity military action to what comes next, that's where the system really kicks in, isn't it? When the resistance finally collapses.
That's the moment. The soldiers weren't just let loose in a random rampage or simple looting, although some of that surely happened. The dominant activity, as described, was different.
It was organized.
Highly organized.
Yeah.
Josephus describes soldiers systematically herding the surviving population's men, women, children toward predetermined collection points within the ruins. Think about that phrasing.
Predetermined. Planned.
Exactly. This wasn't chaos. He describes it almost like a factory floor for human subjugation. Order amidst the destruction.
It sounds less like the spontaneous aftermath of a battle and more like, I don't know, a carefully planned military operation, but with a flowchart for processing human cargo.
That's a good way to put it. And this initial processing, this brutal triage, how did it actually work on the ground?
Yeah, what happened at those collection points?
The separation was immediate and absolute. Men of fighting age. Instantly separated. They were destined for immediate execution or, perhaps worse, for specialized, short-term, heavy labor in the quarries or mines until they dropped. Useful, then disposable.
And the elderly.
The elderly, the infirm. They were seen as having negative market value. They consumed resources. Josephus says they were dispatched with brutal efficiency.
Eliminated.
Yes, but women and children were different. They were cataloged.
Cataloged. And the fate of the women, particularly the wives of the commanders, the fighters, the sources say their fate was carefully calibrated. What does that mean?
It means their destiny was calculated to serve multiple Roman objectives simultaneously. The primary focus, right away, was identifying and separating the young women, specifically women of childbearing age.
Why them specifically?
Because they represented two critical things to the Roman state. First, immediate, high-value profit in the slave markets. Healthy young women fetched top prices. Second, and perhaps more importantly in the long run, they represented demographic control.
Control.
Yes.
Yeah.
By systematically removing the women who would bear the next generation of potential rebels, Rome was strategically crippling the conquered people's ability to recover. It was ensuring long-term demographic and cultural weakening. It's a calculated state-level move. It's demographic warfare.
That kind of cold, systematic control, it's almost hard to believe without seeing it. Is there actual physical evidence? Does the archaeology back up this idea of calculated processing, not just random killing?
There is, and it's quite profound. Archaeological studies of the 70 CE destruction layer in Jerusalem, particularly in the upper city, where much of the final desperate fighting happened. They've analyzed female skeletal remains, and they show distinctive trauma patterns. This is a really key insight.
Distinctive trauma patterns. What does that mean? How can archaeologists tell the difference between, say, a random sword blow in combat and this calculated injury you're talking about?
Well, typical battlefield injuries, especially in close combat, are often concentrated on the head or the torso kill shots, basically, designed to quickly incapacitate and kill an opponent.
Okay.
The trauma patterns observed on many of these female remains from Jerusalem are different. They're deliberate but non-fatal injuries, often focused on the limbs, wrists, ankles, perhaps disabling blows to the left.
Seems designed to stop them but not kill them.
Precisely. Designed explicitly to incapacitate the victim, stop her from fleeing or fighting back, but crucially to preserve the rest of her body, to maintain her value as merchandise for the slave market.
Like,
A dead captive is worthless to the state treasury. An incapacitated but otherwise intact, valuable captive, highly profitable.
so the violence itself becomes a kind of calculated damage control, applied not out of, battlefield rage, but almost like a business decision. Maximize the investment return on the human capital.
That's exactly how the evidence reads. The positioning of some of these remains, too, showing signs of forced constraint alongside these non-lethal disabling injuries. It strongly refutes the idea that this was just random, undisciplined brutality by worked-up soldiers.
It points to something else.
It points directly to organized processing, standardized procedures, and efficiency that permeated every level of the military operation, right down to the handling of human beings as if they were livestock or cargo. The conquest was the initial harvest. The processing was the sorting and packaging for shipment.
Okay, so we've established this foundation, conquest, as the systematic processing mechanism. Now let's really zero in on the why. What were the strategic drivers that made this horrific system so enduring for Rome? You mentioned three.
Yes, I think it boils down to three overlapping, mutually reinforcing imperial objectives. First, immediate substantial economic profit. Second, long-term demographic prevention or warfare. And third, pervasive psychological domination and cultural erasure.
Let's start with the money, the economic drivers. You said they were the engine.
They absolutely were the engine of this machine, especially in the short term. The immediate profit was, well, astronomical by ancient standards. An attractive, healthy, young female slave could fetch prices equivalent to several years' pay for a Roman legionary.
Several years' pay. Wow, that's a serious incentive.
It's a powerful, direct financial incentive. It meant that methodical capture, careful handling, preserving that market value we talked about, paid far, far greater dividends than simply killing captives or engaging in random damaging violence. It incentivized the system from the individual soldier right up the chain of command.
And this wasn't just about individual soldiers getting a bonus, right? The sources suggest the slave trade itself was fundamental to the Roman economy as a whole.
Absolutely fundamental. It wasn't just incidental revenue from war. It was an essential mechanism for Roman economic expansion. Think about it. You're transforming human beings, quite literally, into liquid capital.
Liquid capital.
Yeah, capital that could be instantly leveraged. These captives could be sold across the Mediterranean, funding the next wave of military campaigns, securing vital supply lines, financing provincial infrastructure projects, paying off veteran legions. It created this self-sustaining, brutal cycle. Conquest funded more conquest.
And we can see just how codified, how important protecting that market value was, even centuries earlier. You mentioned the case of Princess Kayamara back in 89 BCE.
Yes, Kaimar's capture during a campaign against the Galatians in Anatolia is highly illustrative. She was a high-status captive, a princess. That meant her market value, whether she'd be sold as a high-end slave, kept as a concubine, or even used as a diplomatic pawn, was extremely high.
Okay.
When a Roman centurion raped her, he wasn't just committing an act of personal depravity. From the perspective of the Roman military system, he was violating protocol.
He damaged state property, high-value military property.
Precisely. The military doctrine even then clearly specified that high-value captives, especially women, destined for elite markets or political use, must remain unblemished to preserve their optimal market price. The fact that his violation was considered primarily a transgression of military law, an act against the state's financial interest rather than, say, a moral crime against her, tells you everything about the institutional priorities.
That's incredibly revealing. What happened to her, by the way?
Well, Kayamara's story is actually one of resistance, which is rare in these accounts. She later arranged for her followers, who were also captured, to kill the centurion while he was counting the ransom money her family had sent. Then she famously delivered his severed head back to her husband along with the ransom.
Wow, a moment of defiance against the system.
A powerful one, yes. But her initial experience fundamentally confirms the system's priority: profit and the preservation of asset value, even over the immediate desires or lack of discipline of individual soldiers.
Okay, so that's the short-term profit mechanism. Let's look at the long game you mentioned, demographic warfare. It sounds like Rome viewed this not just as some unfortunate side effect of war, but as a deliberate long-term investment in geopolitical control. How explicit were they about that strategy?
Well, Roman sources wouldn't use our modern term demographic warfare, obviously, but their actions, consistently applied across centuries and continents, speak volumes. By systematically removing vast numbers of women, particularly young women, who form the reproductive core of these defeated communities, Rome was intentionally creating demographic crises.
Crises that lasted.
Crises that the historical and archaeological evidence suggests took generations, sometimes centuries, to resolve. The conquered enemies weren't just militarily defeated in the present, they were rendered demographically and culturally weakened far into the future. This ensured they couldn't realistically recover to pose a significant new threat for decades, maybe longer.
So it's not just about killing the fighters today, it's about actively preventing the birth of the potential fighters of tomorrow.
That's the cold logic of it. And this tactic wasn't hidden. It was often quite publicly used as propaganda. We have accounts, for instance, from Caesar's campaigns in Gaul.
What did Caesar do?
His forces made a deliberate public display of the systematic removal of women and children from certain rebellious Gallic tribes. This wasn't just about processing captives. It was about sending an unmistakable, terrifying message to every other tribe, every potential resistor across the Roman frontier. Defy us, and we won't just destroy your armies, we will destroy your family lines, we will erase your future.
That psychological impact that takes us straight into the third objective you outlined, cultural erasure and psychological domination.
Yes, and this is where the targeting becomes even more strategically refined.
Yeah.
Roman forces didn't just grab any woman. They often specifically targeted women who held positions of particular cultural or religious importance within their communities.
Like who?
Priestesses, traditional healers, respected elder women, the wives of tribal chieftains or elders who were seen as repositories of generational history and custom.
Why the specific focus on these cultural figures? What was the strategic value in targeting them?
Because their systematic humiliation, their public degradation, and often their systematic sexual violation served a distinct purpose. It demonstrated Rome's complete and utter dominance over the enemy's entire social and spiritual structure, not just their military capacity.
It's a message.
It's a powerful, visceral form of psychological warfare. It communicated directly to the surviving men and the community as a whole. Your gods cannot protect your holy women. Your traditions cannot save your wives. Your culture is broken under our heel. It aimed to demoralize and break the will to resist on the deepest possible level.
And this whole horrific practice, it was somehow normalized within Roman society itself, wasn't it? You mentioned the suffering of captives being turned into entertainment.
Absolutely. It's disturbing, but Roman literature, poetry, plays, histories, and especially their monumental art routinely feature captive women. But they don't portray the full horror. They transform the suffering.
How so?
They turn these women into plot devices, into symbols of Roman virility and imperial supremacy. The captive woman becomes a trope, often depicted weeping or pleading, reinforcing the narrative of Roman power and the justified subjugation of the barbarian. This process served to justify the cruelty back home, culturally normalizing the idea that conquered peoples existed primarily to serve Rome's needs and desires.
So the image of the weeping, chained, captive woman becomes like an official, predictable motif in their victory celebrations and art.
Precisely. It becomes part of the visual language of empire, reinforcing the legitimacy of the system that produced her suffering.
What's truly staggering, I think, when you lay it all out, is how institutionalized this whole process was. This wasn't just, organized violence on the battlefield. The Romans backed this massive trafficking operation with sophisticated legal frameworks, detailed administration, and extensive logistical infrastructure. It seems like it was refined over centuries. This was an engineered industry.
That's exactly the right way to think about it, an industry. And let's start with the legal bedrock. Roman law, which often prided itself on its structure and supposedly its justice, was explicit about the status of these captured women. Initially, they were classified simply as hostis enemy combatants or members of an enemy population.
Okay, enemy status. But then after capture...
Upon capture, they became what the law termed praeta, or more specifically in a military context, peculium castrans essentially, public spoils, or camp property. This was a concept signifying assets obtained by the collective valor of the soldiers.
Public spoils. What did that classification actually mean in practical terms for the woman herself?
In practical terms, it meant they were legally stripped of all pre-existing rights, protections, or social standing they might have had in their own society. Their bodies, their labor, their very existence were subject to the collective use and discretion of the conquering army, represented by its commanders. They were treated as a fungible asset belonging to the Roman state or the army unit, not as individuals deserving of human consideration under law.
So, that moment of sale, the transition from being public spoils to becoming private property, that must have been critical in the legal sense.
It was a critical transition, yes. Upon sale in the market, they legally became mancipium private property, essentially a thing owned by an individual under Roman slave law. Now, while this transition did, theoretically, afford them the minimal protections that slaves sometimes received under Roman civil law, for instance, protection against completely arbitrary murder by their owner, in some later periods, it was hardly an improvement in their condition.
It sounds like just a different kind of ownership.
It was simply a transition in the nature of their exploitation.
Yeah.
They moved from collective military use and potential battlefield exploitation to individual ownership, domestic servitude, forced agricultural labor, sexual exploitation within a household or brothel, and, crucially, reproductive control by a private master. The legal system didn't rescue them, it simply codified their dehumanization in a different way.
And to manage this enormous continuous flow of human capital, you're talking tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people moving across the empire. Over time, they needed bureaucracy. This couldn't have been just ad hoc raiding parties. This required serious administration.
Absolutely. The Romans were, as we know, meticulous record keepers, especially when it came to state assets and revenue. We have various ancient sources, historical accounts, fragments of official documents describing officials, often specialized provincial administrators or military logisticians, who maintain detailed registers of captured populations.
Registers, like ledgers.
Exactly. These weren't just head counts, though the sheer overall numbers were tracked. These records documented specific, actionable characteristics for each individual, characteristics that directly influence their potential sale price and suitability for different markets.
Thousands upon thousands of human beings meticulously logged like livestock or grain. What specific details were these administrators tracking, and how does that relate back to, say, Deborah Bat Elazar?
They track things like estimated age, apparent physical condition noting injuries or illnesses, any documented skills, like weaving or literacy, sometimes lineage reputation if it was known and considered valuable, and crucially, key physical descriptors, height, build, hair color, eye color, any distinguishing marks.
Like the red-haired one.
Precisely. Think back to Deborah Bat Elazar being reduced to the red-haired one. That descriptor likely wasn't just a casual nickname. It was probably a notation on a manifest, a quick way to identify this particular unit of human property without needing her name, her history, her humanity. Surviving fragments of provincial records and papyri from Egypt show lists, sometimes reaching into the thousands from single campaigns or regions, with notations about pregnancy status, perceived temperament, docile or rebellious, and even country or region of origin, which affected market preferences. It transforms trafficking into systematic state policy, managed by career civil servants.
That level of administrative detail and the sheer scale implies a highly developed logistical supply chain must have existed. They must have treated the transport of these human beings with the same kind of organizational rigor they applied to moving legions, grain shipments, or weaponry.
The logistics were indeed refined over centuries of constant warfare and expansion. Specialized techniques were developed and seemingly taught to the military personnel responsible for guarding and transporting captives, designed to minimize losses, meaning escapes or deaths that reduce profit, and maximize the preservation of market value during forced transport over long distances.
What kinds of techniques are we talking about?
Well, sources mention things like the specific design and use of neck chains or yokes. These weren't just crude chains, they were often designed to connect captives in a line, allowing them to walk, even minimizing chafing to avoid infections that could lower value, but engineered to make running virtually impossible and removal extremely difficult without specialized tools.
So they optimized the restraints for long-distance travel while preserving the condition of the commodity.
Exactly that kind of cold calculation. They also used specific marching formations. These formations often maximize the visibility of the captives to onlookers as they pass through towns and villages, serving as a mobile display of Roman power and a form of advertising for future sales, while simultaneously making communication or coordinated resistance among the captives themselves much harder.
And the forced marches themselves.
They were brutal, designed to exhaust any will to resist. But simultaneously, the guards and personnel were likely trained to ensure the captives received just enough food, water, and basic care to keep them alive and preserve their physical market value upon arrival. It was this horrible, delicate balancing act between brutality and asset management.
And the destinations. The infrastructure at the end of this horrific supply line, the slave markets, they must tell the same story of calculated efficiency.
They do. Major imperial hubs like Rome itself, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, they had massive, specialized slave markets, often located near ports or major crossroads. But it's the archaeological details, particularly from sites like Ostia, which was Rome's main port city. They reveal the depth of the investment in this infrastructure.
What have archaeologists found at Ostia?
Excavations there have uncovered what appear to be large holding facilities, possibly barracks or compounds, that seem specifically designed for holding large numbers of captives, including features suggesting segregation, perhaps for female captives awaiting sale or distribution.
What architectural features suggest they were specifically designed for this purpose, rather than just being general warehouses or barracks?
Features like highly segmented architecture, potentially separate holding areas for captives of different ages, origins, or perceived conditions, reflecting the specific demands of the Roman market. The spaces often seem structurally designed to prevent escape high walls, few windows, controlled access points, while simultaneously allowing maximum, perhaps even unobstructed visibility for potential buyers inspecting the merchandise and for the guards maintaining control.
Like a human showroom.
In a grim sense, yes. And some interpretations suggest these facilities included specific areas for forced bathing, rudimentary grooming, perhaps even providing changes of clothing, all aimed at enhancing the appearance and therefore the price of the captives just before they went to the auction block.
That leads directly to perhaps the most chilling aspect of this whole section, the idea of medical manipulation. Roman forces didn't just employ physicians to treat their own soldiers. Sources suggest they used medical personnel to manage the human cargo as well.
Yes, the medical profession appears to have been, at times, fully integrated into this economic system of exploitation. Doctors or trained medical orderlies examined captive women, not primarily for their health, but to assess their physical condition and determine their suitability for various markets.
Suitability.
Yes, identifying those deemed suitable for hard labor versus domestic service, versus those who might fetch a higher price in brothels or as personal companions. They would treat injuries, but often the goal wasn't the woman's long-term well-being. It was about treating injuries that might visibly reduce her immediate sale price, patching them up for market, essentially.
And the interventions went beyond just treating battlefield wounds or travel fatigue. Our sources indicate things that sound like, well, cosmetic surgery and forced physical changes.
The evidence is fragmentary, but suggestive. It includes practices like force feeding regimens designed specifically to improve the appearance of malnourished captives, making them look healthier or plumper for sale. There are hints at techniques used to mask signs of trauma, illness, or age. Some scholars even speculate about primitive forms of what we might loosely call cosmetic interventions.
That is profoundly disturbing.
It represents perhaps the ultimate expression of this systematic exploitation, the medical profession itself being actively involved in the manipulation of captives' bodies solely to increase their profitability, ensuring the human commodity was presented in the best possible light for maximum return on the state's or the trader's investment. Now, this whole edifice, this profoundly institutionalized system of cruelty, the sexual violence, the mass transport, the deliberate destruction of families, it raises a really important question. How did Rome continually justify this, not just on campaign, but back home, to its own elite, its wider populace?
Yeah, how did they sell this internally?
A huge part of the answer lies in constant, carefully constructed, standardized propaganda.
Propaganda we can actually still see today.
Absolutely. It's literally carved in stone. Visible in the physical record, particularly in the iconography of submission found on their triumphal arches, columns, and monuments erected across the entire empire to celebrate military victories.
What do these monuments show? How do they depict the captives, especially the women?
When they depict captive women, which they frequently do, the portrayals are remarkably consistent. They employ specific, standardized gesture patterns. You often see arms crossed in submission or lowered helplessly. Sometimes the clothing is rendered in a way that suggests disarray, vulnerability, perhaps even implying sexual availability or recent violation. The facial expressions are crafted to convey a very specific blend of terror, sorrow, and resignation.
So these weren't just generic artistic symbols of defeat, they were a deliberate visual language.
Precisely. A visual language designed and deployed by the state. It communicated Rome's total mastery, not just over the enemy army, but over the defeated population's social fabric, their honor, and specifically, their ability to control their own women and reproduction. It was a visual reinforcement of Rome's dominance over the very future of the conquered people.
And the ultimate expression of this kind of public spectacle, psychological theater, must have been the official triumph parade in Rome itself. You mentioned Titus's triumph after Jerusalem.
Yes, Titus's triumph in 71 CE, celebrating the victory over Judea, is perhaps the most famously documented example. Our sources, including Josephus again, and the depictions on the Arch of Titus, which still stands in Rome, detail the massive parade. It included not just the famous treasures looted from the Jerusalem temple, like the menorah.
But people, too.
Yes, hundreds, perhaps thousands of Jewish captives were marched through Rome. And critically, the sources emphasize that many of these were specifically chosen high-status individuals, including the wives and children of the defeated rebel commanders and leaders. They were displayed prominently in the procession.
Displayed with a specific intent, presumably, not just randomly pulled from the crowd.
Oh, absolutely, with intent. They were shown in chains, often dressed in clothing designed perhaps to emphasize their former status in stark contrast with their current degradation. They were positioned in the parade to maximize their visibility to the huge Roman crowds lining the route. The entire triumph was a carefully choreographed, visceral demonstration that Rome had not just defeated Judea's army, but had utterly subjugated its leadership, its religious institutions, and the very continuation of the enemy's social and reproductive structures.
And the consequences of this whole system, they weren't just psychological for the victims or economic for Rome. You mentioned earlier they were profoundly generational, creating demographic shifts that lasted for centuries. This sounds like pure enforced demographic engineering on a massive scale.
That's exactly what it amounts to. The systematic removal of huge numbers of indigenous women from conquered territories, Gaul, Spain, Britain, Dacia, Judea, North Africa, you name it, and the subsequent, often simultaneous, importation of slave populations brought in from other distant conquered regions. This fundamentally and intentionally altered the demographic and genetic makeup of vast areas of the empire.
Is there modern scientific evidence that actually backs up the sheer scale of these forced population movements described in the ancient texts?
Yes, there is, increasingly so. Modern genetic studies analyzing DNA from both ancient remains and contemporary populations across Europe and the Mediterranean, coupled with archaeological evidence of settlement patterns and trade routes, consistently show large-scale population admixtures and movements across the former Roman Empire. And crucially, these patterns often correspond precisely to the historically documented Roman conquests and the known trafficking routes for slaves.
So you can literally see the genetic echoes of these policies today.
In many regions, yes. For instance, populations in Italy, particularly around Rome, show highly diverse genetic markers that align with known areas of large-scale Roman military activity and subsequent slave importation from the Near East, North Africa, Northern Europe. It provides powerful confirmation of the long-term structural demographic changes that Rome deliberately implemented in both the core and the conquered provinces.
And for the children born into the system, children born to these captive women after they were sold into slavery, the system seemed designed to ensure their original family identities, their cultural roots, were systematically destroyed.
Utterly destroyed. That was arguably the final, crucial stage of the cultural erasure process. Children born to enslaved captive women generally grew up knowing only slavery, belonging legally to their mother's owner. Masters actively, often violently, prevented these children from learning their mother's native languages, her cultural practices, her religious beliefs, or any details about her family history or place of origin.
Why? What was the purpose of severing that connection so completely?
Any connection to the conquered, potentially defiant culture was seen as a threat. It had to be suppressed. The clear purpose was to create a vast, rootless population whose loyalty, identity, and entire frame of reference were exclusively tied to their Roman masters and the Roman system. They then reproduced Roman social hierarchies, biologically and culturally. They were, in effect, reproducing the system of domination itself within their own offspring.
Yet, even faced with such a comprehensive, brutal system of dehumanization, the sources still seem to show some flickers of desperate resistance, don't they?
They do, and it's vital we recognize that, however difficult it is to find in sources written largely by the victors. The records do sometimes point to things like increased rates of female suicide during the final stages of conquest, women choosing death over capture, and what they knew awaited them. We hear of desperate attempts by families and communities to hide women and girls before the Roman lines were breached, and perhaps most tragically, instances where entire communities chose mass death, killing each other, rather than submitting to the systematic sexual and reproductive exploitation that Roman victory represented. Think of Masada.
Masada, right. But what about the quieter forms of resistance? The resilience of those who did survive the markets, the forced transport, the life of slavery. The system was designed to break all connections, separating sisters, dividing mothers from daughters, scattering people from the same community across vast distances and different buyers.
That systematic fragmentation was absolutely a deliberate anti-resistance measure, making solidarity almost impossible. But even so, the scattered sources, sometimes read between the lines, do hint at a remarkable resilience. Stories, often anecdotal or preserved in later traditions, of women who secretly maintained elements of their cultural practices, perhaps religious rites performed in secret. Women who managed to pass down fragments of their native language, songs, or origin stories to their children in whispers against incredible odds.
They kept something alive.
They tried. And there are hints of women managing to forge hidden support networks with other captives, even those from different backgrounds, sharing information, offering comfort, creating small pockets of shared humanity within the brutal structure of slavery. The spirit of defiance, the core of cultural identity, persisted in some ways, even when the overwhelming force of the Roman system sought to crush it entirely. Hashtag tag out outro.
Well, this deep dive into the dark machinery of Roman conquest has been, frankly, quite challenging. Heavy stuff. But I think it's revealed a necessary, if uncomfortable, truth. Rome's systematic trafficking in the wives of defeated warriors wasn't just a byproduct of war, not some regrettable excess or crime of passion.
No, the evidence points clearly elsewhere.
It points to it being a sophisticated, highly regulated, deeply embedded economic and military strategy, a deliberate strategy, as the sources put it, of demographic warfare. It seems Rome successfully transformed human exploitation into a kind of science, generating immense profit while strategically preventing the cultural and demographic recovery of conquered peoples, ensuring long-term geopolitical subjugation.
I think the key takeaway for me, and hopefully for you listening, is the sheer sophistication of these practices. It wasn't just brutality, it was organized brutality. The specialized logistics for transport, the detailed administrative systems for record-keeping and valuation, the legal frameworks designed specifically to enable and normalize the violence, and the cultural programming, the propaganda, visible in their art and literature.
It all adds up.
It all adds up to establish these foundational organizational templates for mass human exploitation. And tragically, these templates, the methods of classification, commodification, transport, justification, they didn't die with Rome. They were refined, adapted, and replicated by subsequent imperial powers, colonial regimes, and oppressive systems throughout history, establishing a disturbing line of continuity in institutionalized human exploitation.
The true horror, perhaps, lies in that calculation we kept coming back to. If you consider the evidence the archaeologists suggesting increasingly sophisticated trafficking methods over time, from the initial battlefield processing to specialized holding facilities near markets, even the hints of medical enhancement, it almost implies a continuous, deliberate research and development process.
A chilling thought. R&D into techniques for human commodification, refined across centuries of Roman expansion and conquest.
Yeah. And this leaves us, and you, with a final provocative thought to consider. How does that legacy, that deep history of institutionalizing systematic human destruction and exploitation for geopolitical and financial gain, how might that legacy continue to subtly, or perhaps not so subtly, influence how powerful societies, institutions, or even economies treat vulnerable, displaced, or conquered populations in our world today?
It's a critical connection to explore. We really invite you to continue investigating that enduring and often hidden connection between past systems and present realities.